So next, we have Ben Worthy and Kat Morgan from Birkbeck, who address the very timely question whether increased monitoring and more data about MPs is leading to better behavior by MPs. And I think it is Ben who's going to present that.
Thank you. Yes, it is indeed. Okay. So quite a few are aware of this project already. So what I wanted to do was just quickly skip through some of the background to remind everybody, and then focus on kind of 4 of the findings that are coming out of the project, and end with a few thoughts on how this could apply to the ongoing newest and latest lobbying scandal. So I'm going to do the presentation today. Unfortunately, Kat can't be with us today, but she's, as you can see, part of the project. So this project began almost 2 years ago. Is a Leverhulme funded project that looks at the way in which people are using new data to try and hold MPs and peers to account and to monitor what they're doing. It asks kind of 3 big questions, which are: who is using all of this new data? What are they using it for? And what impact is it having both on Parliament and democracy? But I wanted to boil it down to this really fundamental question, which is kind of underlies all of what we're discussing, which is, does more data make for better behaved politicians? Because the fundamental problem with information in democracy is that there is a huge gap and an asymmetry between voters, most of whom are only occasionally interested in what their representatives are doing, and their representatives who have full information and full interest in what's happening. And into this gap, into this asymmetry, can lie all sorts of difficulties and problems. So potentially, hypothetically, an elected legislator can engage in voting in ways that the constituents wouldn't approve of. They could even engage in making money for themselves, or they could simply do their job rather badly. And advocates of transparency argue that if you publish more data, more information about what it is legislators are doing, this can have 2 effects. One is to make sure that those who are behaving badly get caught out, and also that the very potential of having this information or data out there might make legislators and politicians not behave badly in the before it even happens, rather in a similar idea to what Chris just said about impeachment. So this is the theory, and one thing we can be very sure of is there is a lot of new data and information available. This is the most famous of these applications. This is They Work For You, created by some volunteers in 2004 and taken up by My Society in 2005. It tells you how each individual MP and peer votes, what they've been doing in Parliament, and also very contemporaneously their register of interests as well. It isn't just that. You can log on to MPs' expenses info to look at individual or groups of MPs. You could log on to members' interests to look at an updated version of all their interest claims. You can make a freedom information request to find out about what's been going on. And also you can consult a whole range of formal bodies who regularly publish data, not least the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority that regularly publishes data on MPs' expenses and costs. Alongside this, there's a whole host of innovations. I probably mentioned this before. This is my favorite. A Twitter bot that tells you every time somebody from within the parliamentary estate with a parliamentary IP address has made a change to Wikipedia. So the data is definitely there. One of the difficulties is there's all sorts of problems and assumptions between the existence of the data and it then having the effect that you would want in closing this gap. It depends very much if or how the data are used. It would very much depend on how those being watched behave as a result. You would imagine one theory is that having more data will deter you from behaving badly if you're being watched, but it also could conceivably make you better at hiding things instead. And this all plays into questions about how the data are understood and also all sorts of biases in data. We know very well that data is not objective. They are not objective. And there's all sorts of skews within them that have all sorts of effects. As well as this, when we look in legislatures in particular, there's even more problems that arise. Actually, the history of legislatures around the world is a history of battles between secrecy and resistance. And actually, one of the problems for legislatures in particular, and I heartily recommend this book by Hibbing and Thies Morse, is the idea that when people look at legislatures, they see all the things about politics that they dislike all in one single place. So they see partisanship, they see seemingly endless bickering over processes rather than getting things done, and they also see issues around lobbying and self-interest. And of course, all this data about MPs is laid atop a whole series of pre-existing tensions around who MPs should represent, who they should be accountable to, and whether or not they are trusted. So we've spent the last 2 years doing all sorts of things, as some of you know. We've spoken to more than 30 different innovators, journalists, campaigners, ex-MPs and peers. We've done a survey of people who are using this data. We've done a YouGov poll of 100 MPs to see what they think about it, which is very interesting. We've analysed media reporting of data. We've got quite a few case studies now put together. And we also did a living lab where some students did some live searches for data on MPs. And we've also done some Hansard analysis. So now I just want to give you kind of 4 rather different and overlapping and in some ways sort of contradictory findings to try and answer the question. So the first finding is more data does actually make for better behaved politicians. We found that actually data about how they vote and attendance and expenses does make MPs more accountable. They spend more time explaining what they're doing, justifying it, and they've also started to use this data themselves as part of their representational performance. Have a look at this. This image sent out with a tweet from Andrew Bridgen when he was voting against the COVID lockdowns. In a more general sense, all this data makes for the possibility of measurement, of ranking between MPs, but also between individual MPs and the idea of what an MP should be doing. And it's also opened up, whether by accident or intentionally, all sorts of new and different areas. To give you some examples, we've seen MPs using tweets or Hansard to use the data on voting to show what a good MP they've been. Also found in both the House of Lords and House of Commons that there's been a reluctance to claim expenses or allowances because, in part, the data is published. And here's a wonderful example of one Conservative MP who admitted that they were speaking because one of their colleagues had Googled them and found on their work view that they hadn't made many speeches, so they decided to make one. Give you a couple more interesting examples. A Freedom Information request revealed how many MPs were also landlords, obviously very relevant to discussions around what Parliament is doing in these areas. On the other side of the page, you can see an example of The Guardian working with a NGO called Desmog. And what they did was painstakingly put together a climate change scorecard for every single MP in Parliament just before the last election, where they matched up their voting record, their register of interests and their donations. This actually led to Conservative MPs publicly complaining to The Guardian that they were being misrepresented by this. And here, very relevantly, you can see DataLogo, who have done some analysis of MPs' additional income and on top of their salary in the last Parliament, 2017 to 2019. They divide this by party, but also by gender. And you'll find that the highest earning MP, well, you maybe can't see his name there, but to give you a clue, he's Prime Minister. But then we get to a second, more complicated question, which is whether the data helps to close the gap between voters and members. And this is a bit more tricky. Definitely the existence of sites like They Work For You and Data does make it more accessible and potentially easier to find. We've discovered that the data are often used as a kind of shortcut to understand an MP, to understand what they've been doing, and even to understand what they might do in the future. And what's really interesting is the way that the data and the measurements about expenses, voting, whether they've turned up, has entered into the everyday language of how we talk about politicians in terms of both the House of Lords and the House of Commons. But I suppose the rather disappointing finding is all this data has not changed in a large scale way how many people vote. And we found both in the MP's expenses and more recently over Brexit, that actually a single piece of information about an MP doesn't shift a lot of voters and how they operate for all sorts of different reasons. We did also find on the other side of this is that more data makes for more political conflict. Yes, it can make MPs more accountable, but it can also make them resist more. It can open up old conflicts or kind of create new ones. And it also creates a battle over what data can mean. So it creates a battle over narratives as well, to go back to the earlier presentation about some of these ideas. Here's a great example of it going in the wrong direction. After the House of Commons account tweeted out some voting records, a group of Conservative politicians complained about the reporting, and now the House of Commons Twitter account no longer tweets out voting records, so a return to secrecy rather than openness. More data also related to this makes for more manipulation. And one thing we found is that data are not just used to help politicians and help accountability, but they can also be used and abused by the media and politicians themselves to support particular narratives. So we saw over Brexit that voting records for the House of Commons and the House of Lords were used to try and show that those two bodies were trying to, inverted commas, block Brexit. And also around the House of Lords, we discovered that there's a constant analysis of the House of Lords as a kind of elitist institution that's out of touch, that's and that's desperately in need of reform. And finally, one concern that came up in the YouGov poll, it also comes up in mentions in Hansard when MPs are talking about, is that more data makes for more misrepresentation as well. The data definitely tells us a great deal about voting expenses. One of the dangers is that it overemphasizes these activities and leaves others kind of in the darkness. So we know very little systematically about what MPs do in their own constituencies. And it also, to make it totally relevant, leaves other areas dataless, particularly over lobbying. So I just wanted to end with a few concluding thoughts about the current lobbying scandal. For anybody who's not been closely following events in the UK, essentially one MP was going through the formal process around possible suspension over breaking lobbying rules, and instead of allowing it through, the government attempted to resist it, and it's now opened up a huge monitoring of all sorts of other lobbying activities by different MPs. What we found here is that data can make for accountability. Owen Paterson's lobbying activities were revealed by an FOI request nearly 2 years ago. It can take some time. It can also provoke avoidance and pretty spectacular attempts at resistance, as we saw last week with the vote. It can also, as we've very much seen, help us reinforce particular narratives about MPs and Parliament. One big open question for the project, and I suppose for us as well, is whether actually these sort of data-driven scandals can also help kickstart meaningful change. So that's stuff from me. Thank you.